You're listening to the Grace Plus Zero podcast, exploring the crossroads of culture, faith, and family from a biblical worldview. And now your host.
Solomon says in Proverbs 18:21, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof." Welcome to Grace Plus Zero. I'm your host, Brian Moore. Remind you that our podcast is available on iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher, Pod Addict, and anywhere else that you may get your podcast fix. We're also available on YouTube. Just visit Grace Plus Zero on YouTube. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Grace Plus Zero. That's all one word, @ Grace Plus Zero. You can follow us on Facebook at Grace Plus Zero. And all of our podcasts will drop there as well as soon as we publish them. So if you would like to send us an email with thoughts or questions about the show, you can do so at the gpzpodcast@gmail.com. That's gpzpodcast@gmail.com. All right. Well, today's program, titled Thanos, Words, and Reality, I want to talk to you a little bit about a recent Marvel Avengers movie that came out. Was one of the largest films ever to hit the big screen. And in the recent movie, the antagonist was a gentleman by the name of Thanos. Thanos acquired an Infinity Stone, which allowed him to change the reality around him. And with this fictional stone, Thanos, the villain, says, "Reality can be whatever I want." Well, we know this is pure fiction. It's simply a comic book put on the big screen, but it does say a lot about our current culture. Today, a lot of people think they can control reality in much the same way that Thanos did, except they aren't using a fictional Infinity Stone to do so. They're using actual words. And by redefining words, there have been multiple attempts to basically control or make reality become whatever people would have it be. Now, George Orwell, of course, the author of 1984, said, "Control language and you control the masses." He said, "He who controls language controls the argument." And nothing could be further from the truth. To give you a couple of examples. For example, ranchers occupying a government building would be called terrorism, but a Muslim fanatic gunning down soldiers while yelling Allahu Akbar is nothing more than workplace violence. A war in the Middle East becomes known as an overseas contingency plan. A child in a mother's womb is nothing more than a fetus. An abortion is simply redefined as a choice. Instead of attending a Christmas play or a program, it's ironic that it becomes a winter play. Rehabilitation programs, or what we would call rehab, becomes wellness programs. While deviancy is being celebrated, abominations are being labeled alternative lifestyles. And grounded Christian morality is taking on names such as intolerance and bigotry. And in most cases, all these so-called changes that I'm referencing here are done in the name of diversity, inclusion, and intolerance. But the simple truth is, no matter how you do it, it's just a way to try to attempt to control reality. Obscuring plain truth is nothing more than a hallmark of evil. If there's confusion, we all know who the author of confusion is. I'm going to give you a perfect example of this. Women are losing this battle of words on a daily basis, and a perfect example would be the recent strain of women losing athletic competitions to men who simply identify as women. They simply say they're a woman, and suddenly that supposedly changes reality, or at least that's what they think. Well, the truth is, biological men are beating women in competition and it is being celebrated as if it is, and if they are in reality, real biological physical women, simply because, not of an infinity stone, but because of a word. And that word is, I'm a woman. Simply saying it makes it so. Well, we know that's not the case. Another example that has basically reared its ugly head here recently in the last couple of weeks came from the lips of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who recently stated that a woman who exercises her constitutional right to terminate her pregnancy is not a mother. If she's not a mother, then for those ladies who are taking those photos and who are feeling the baby kick and move in their womb and are celebrating the little baby bumps that they get when they first become pregnant, are those ladies not mothers? I mean, there's a lot of things that we need to take into consideration, of course, but simply changing the language and saying something or is not something does not change the reality. When words lose their meaning, someone else will lose something. It never fails to happen. What we're witnessing here is a society and a culture that simply thinks by changing a word, they can change reality, when in fact reality doesn't change at all. A man who recently entered a hospital, an emergency room hospital, and this is a very interesting story and is a perfect modern day example of what we're talking about. This man enters the ER of a hospital complaining with severe stomach cramps. While he was in the hospital, the staff began treating the man, trying to figure out what the source of his problem was. Shortly thereafter, they discovered this man is about to give birth. That's right, the so-called man was actually a woman who was in labor. It wasn't stomach cramps, it was labor pains. Now, had the hospital been aware that this patient was an actual woman, the likelihood that they would have been able to have prevent the child from being stillborn is much greater. But the hospital approached the patient as if he were a biological male, and they were looking for another cause of his symptoms. Now, unbelievably, the patient is actually accusing the hospital of being biased or having some sort of animosity or even discriminating against him because she says, the patient is basically accusing the hospital of assuming that a man could not have a child. Well, you and I both know that a man cannot have a child. And saying that a man can have a child does not change the reality of the matter. Unfortunately, in this particular incident, a child died as a result of it. Now, as crazy as this sounds, this woman was not able to change reality by simply changing a word or changing the meaning of words. This woman didn't create reality, and this woman cannot change it. That attribute belongs only to God. Proverbs 21:22 says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord pondereth the hearts." Let's take a break. Welcome back. We always say here on Grace Plus Zero that history matters. And in our History Matters segment this week, I'll tell you a little bit about the Black Robe Regiment. This is basically a miniature portrait of Reverend Peter Muhlenberg, and this took place several years ago. It was Sunday morning in the early year 1776 in the church where Pastor Muhlenberg was actually preaching, and it was a regular service for his congregation. But it was quite a different affair for Muhlenberg himself. Muhlenberg's text for the day was Ecclesiastes 3, where he explains, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted." Well, coming to the end of his sermon, Muhlenberg turned to the congregation and said, "In the language of the Holy Writ, there was a time for all things, a time to preach and a time to pray, but those times have passed away." As those assembled looked on, Peter Muhlenberg declared, "There is a time to fight, and that time is now coming." Muhlenberg then proceeded to remove his robe, much to the shock of the congregation, revealing a military uniform underneath. Marching to the back of the church, he declared, "Who among you is with me?" And on that day, 300 men from his church stood up and joined Peter Muhlenberg. They eventually became the 8th Virginia Brigade, fighting for liberty. This is just a little nugget in the history of America and the fact that faith and our faithful leaders had a major role in the American Revolution. Usually every day about this time of the episode, we share some news with you. Today we're not going to share any recent updates or news with you, but we are going to tell you to start visiting our Facebook page and our Twitter page for interesting news links, and we would like to see what you, the listener, has to say about some of these news articles that we're posting, and maybe share some of those comments that you leave behind as well. On those comments we'll share here on the podcast. All right, now we're going to talk about some words in the Bible, words for the day. Last week we didn't have one, but this week we've got 3, and we're going to talk about these words for just a few short minutes. One of the words in the Bible that sometimes people find a little bit confusing is the word graven, Graven. And the word graven means carved. As an example, this will be in Deuteronomy 27:15, where it says, "Cursed be the man that maketh any graven or molten image." A graven image is a carved image. Another word that sometimes causes confusion for those that read it in the Bible is the word forswear. 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 Forswear means to perjure. In Matthew 5:33 we read, "Thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths." In other words, thou shalt not perjure thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. A lot of people, as we mentioned in the last episode, so help me God has been removed from all House of Representatives oaths just recently. And it makes you wonder just a little bit about taking an oath, but this particular verse is telling us not to perjure ourselves when you see the word forswear. Another word that has come up a few times I've actually had in conversation is the word kine, K-I-N-E. And the word kine basically means cows, cattle, or herd. And in Genesis 41:18 we read, "And behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-flavored." Flavored. I'm eating them before they are actually cooked here. They're fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. Now, it's believed in this particular case here in Genesis 41:18 that we're talking about a herd of buffalo, but the word kine actually equals the word cow nonetheless. We'll be right back after these messages. Well, time for parting shots, and I want to mention a few things here. It's a very interesting little nugget that I came across from a little while back. And it's about a church sign that we've seen. And this church sign read, "We determine our eternal destiny by how we respond to God's doctrine." Well, I believe this particular statement is a blatant denial of God's word. Driving a little bit further down the road, saw another sign that was very similar. And this is what it read. It said, "It all started when Jesus said, 'It is finished.'" Now, the first definition that you'll find in the dictionary for the word finish is to bring to an end. And for finished with ED on the end of it, the definition means perfected or accomplished. For some reason, I guess we need wise men of the world to tell us that the word finished actually means started. You can see how confused this would make people. And I guess I myself have been confused if I actually thought that finished meant finished, at least according to the world. The word finished actually means completed, accomplished, or perfected. Now, modernity will actually tell you that, oh no, finished actually means it's just the beginning, as so read the church sign. Well, what they're actually telling us is that instead of Christ saying it is finished, he should have said it is just now started. Well, I'm not going to buy that. As for me, I'll take the time-honored and true meaning of the word finished, and I'll contend that Christ said what he meant, and he meant what he said. He said he had finished the work that his Father gave him to do, and he said so in John 17:4. I believe that. He said he came to save his people from their sins, and I believe he did that. Read Matthew 1:21. The Apostle Paul said Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. 1 Timothy 1:15. If you feel yourself to be a sinner, and I feel myself to be a sinner, I have a sweet hope that I am among those that he came to save. If he came for the purpose of saving his people, he either did it or he didn't. And if he didn't, then he was a failure, and he failed to do what he came to do. I don't believe he failed. I believe he finished the work his Father gave him to do. I don't believe he started it when he died on the cross. I believe he finished it. I believe he rose victorious over death, hell, and the grave. Until next time, I'm Brian Moore reminding you, from the rising of the sun until the going down of the same, the name of the Lord shall be praised.